Terrific. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rebecca Manley, for those of you who haven't met me, and I'm the chair of the Department of History. And I'd like to welcome you all to this year's annual Nugent Lecture, our first ever virtual Nugent Lecture. The lecture itself, the Nugent Lecture, was made possible by a very generous bequest from Bernice Nugent, who was an undergraduate student here at Queen's in the 1930s and dedicated her estate to supporting lectures and talks within the department. The Nugent Bequest funds our annual seminar series, which has been meeting regularly in this virtual format, and it also funds our annual sort of marquee event of the year, which normally we would be meeting in person. There would be drinks and bites to eat afterwards, and we'd have a chance to socialize. So we regret that that is not possible, but we're delighted to be able to proceed with the Nugent Lecture in any case. The annual Nugent Lecture is delivered by a historian of international stature whose scholarship speaks beyond his or her specific field and has something to impart to all of us. This year's speaker fits that bill perfectly, particularly in this upside down year in which we've all been compelled to engage with digital materials. The talk today is very fitting, and there's nobody who's better poised to deliver it than our speaker today. It's my pleasure to ask Dr. Lisa Pizzoli, who's one of the co-conveners of this year's seminar series, to introduce Dr. Ian Milligan. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good morning, and thanks to everyone for being here. Hello, faculty, students, visitors, and hello also to prospective grad students. So I'm Lisa Pizzoli from the Department of History, speaking to you from my home in Kingston, which is on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and an acknowledgement that makes me reflect on how we're all still grounded in places, even as our connections to each other, and as we're going to hear about today, to the tools of our profession are taking place in virtual realms. So before I get to Dr. Milligan's introduction, just a logistical note, we'll save questions for the end. And if you could indicate your desire to ask a question by using the chat function, that will allow me to keep track of the order of questions. So I'd just also like to quickly thank Cindy Fair for helping to organize this event and orchestrating the Zoom setup, and Jen Lucas, Kathy Dickinson, Matt Colby, and Drs. Pandey and Manley, and my co-convener, Jeff Collins, helped with other aspects of Dr. Milligan's visit, so thanks to them as well. So it is my absolute pleasure to do today's introduction of Dr. Ian Milligan. Dr. Milligan is an associate professor of history at the University of Waterloo, and he's the author of 2 books. The first was 2014's Rebel Youth, 1960s Labor Unrest, Young Workers, and New Leftists in English Canada. And the second and more recent is History in the Age of Abundance, How the Web is Transforming Historical Research, which was published in 2019. And this book has fostered a really rich discussion among historians about how we will deal with born digital sources. And I do think it's worth noting that this book was the subject of a prestigious roundtable review in the American Historical Review in the fall of 2020. He's also co-authored Exploring Big Historical Data, The Historian's Macroscope, which was published in 2015, and he co-edited the Sage Handbook of Web History. And added to these books is a long list of journal articles and book chapters, including, I would just highlight many that are co-authored. And indeed, Professor Milligan's commitment to and depth of collaboration makes him unique among historians. His publications include research conducted with archivists, with librarians, with computer scientists, and of course, other historians and humanists. And I would just say here that I've never before seen a CV, or at least a historian CV, with a section that includes software reviews, which I think speaks to his interdisciplinarity. So this commitment to working across disciplines has earned him many accolades, including article prizes and university and professional association awards for research excellence. He was just given, for example, the 2020 Honorary Archivist Award from the Association of Canadian Archivists, which I think is a really unique honor. His service to the field of digital history is notable and includes serving as a co-editor of the journal Internet Histories. And as we found out here at Queen's, Dr. Milligan is particularly generous in terms of engaging students with digital history. So we were lucky that as part of his Nugent visit, he's offered 2 workshops to our grad students on methods and approaches of digital history last week and this week, and we're very grateful for what he shared in those workshops. So thank you, Ian. His work has been supported by numerous SSHRC grants over the years, and right now he is the principal investigator of the Archives Unleashed project, which works to make historical internet content more accessible. This project is supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And last but not least, Dr. Milligan is a graduate of Queen's and a product of our history department, having received his BA in history from here some years ago. So all of this signals that Dr. Milligan really is leading the way for historians as we all grapple with digital sources, web archives, and the issues that arise with the fusion of technology and historical practice. And as Dr. Manley noted, these issues have been with us for some time now, but they've bubbled to the surface in particularly intense ways this year. So it's with great pleasure and anticipation that I turn it over to Dr. Milligan, who is asking, are we all digital historians now? So Ian, over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that gracious introduction. Hopefully you can all see my slide, not my speaker notes. That's my thing. So I just want to start off before I get into the lecture to really thank Dr. Pizzoli for that generous introduction and for connecting with me and making this possible, to Dr. Rebecca Manley, the chair of the history department, and to Cindy, Kathy, Matt, and Jen. Especially, I know in Zoom we're very cautious about keeping things secure, so I really do appreciate that. And of course, to the Nugent lecture series for making this and the related workshops possible. So it's a complete pleasure to be here today to talk about, are we all digital historians now? Technology and historical practice. And I'd be remiss, it was great to see so many faces in the Brady Bunch squares of Zoom that I recognize from my own time at Queen's. I obviously wish I could be there in person. I'm a 2006 history grad. Hopefully we'll find some chance to come back to campus in person once we're through all this. And I'd be there in person. I would have a haircut. It would be great. And of course, all of the great stuff from today's lecture, you can chalk up to my Queen's education. And then all of the bad things from today's lecture, you can chalk up to the corrupting influence of the University of Waterloo. So good to see you all here today. Now, as Dr. Pizzoli mentioned, my last book, which was published in 2019, History in the Age of Abundance, was looking at the impact that web archives, old websites at the Internet Archive or Library and Archives Canada or elsewhere, we're going to have on histories written about the post-1996 period. But while I was talking about this project, the questions and answers, I was often asked by historians, how different is what you're talking about, born digital web archives and Twitter, etc. How is that different from all historical work? Aren't we all undergoing a transformation? I'd be asked by a medieval historian, hey, my work has dramatically changed. Or 19th Canadianist would say, a lot of the pressures you're talking about 1990s research, I'm seeing in my own work too. And so that's a launch pad then for one of my next projects, of which this Nugent lecture is the first sneak peek at the work I've been doing on this, which I have to mention is under contract with Cambridge Elements in Historical Theory and Practice, who's edited by someone who many of you are familiar with as your colleague and former principal, Professor Daniel Wolf, for a short monograph, The Transformation of History in the Digital Age, which is looking at these broader questions. What does it mean to do history here in the 21st century, whether you're studying the 14th, the 19th, or the late 20th century? So this is really the first presentation of something that will hopefully become this book, which I'm hoping to also make open access. So What about it? Coming to the topic of the lecture. What has fundamentally transformed for all historians in the digital age? And I think the entryway to this question is to imagine a historian working today in 2021. And now I know it's a lot different to work in 2021. As I had the pleasure of meeting grad students at Queen's last week, and we'll be meeting again. You know, we are in a very different world today in 2021 during the COVID pandemic. But as with everything, COVID has accelerated but not invented trends. You know, we're all gathering remotely during COVID. We're doing this lecture over Zoom. But presumably most of you have been able to do some research over the last year when we haven't been able to physically go to our archives and libraries. So what I'm talking about today is not the COVID age, but it's the digital age. And as with everything, COVID is accelerating the trends that we've seen in the digital age in historical scholarship, but I don't think it's invented the trends that we're seeing. COVID is making clear to, I think, all of us how digitally mediated our work is. But these are processes that have been going on for 2 decades. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today, I don't think it's just describing 2021, but it's increasingly describing all historical work that has been done in the last decade and a half. So let's look at this transformation. And I think the best way to start thinking about this is to think a little bit about the research workflow of how a historian works. And so here's what we do. We start our projects by doing a literature review. We find our historiographical problem. We identify the primary sources. We analyze the primary sources. We write, we revise. We give sneak peeks of our research at conferences and by writing peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. And then we finish it with our dissertation or our book. And so when you look at that, on the surface, it looks, hey, 50 years ago, this is what we did, and today, that's what we do. And I think that's because we kind of imagine research in a traditional sense. That if you do a Google image search and you look at the images for historians, you really see that when people think of historians, they can think of historians in a sort of analog, tweety way. And I don't think that's necessarily just how we're represented in pop culture, but I think it's how we understand ourselves as a profession. But of course, how do historians really work? We're not sitting necessarily poring over primary text in person. We are, of course, sitting in front of our computers like we're all doing right now. Everything that I highlighted in that slide talking about the research workflow is mediated through this, a screen. And so if we were to return again to the research workflow and thought about the role that digital technology is playing, you can start to see how quickly things have changed at all stages of the what a historian does. That when we do our literature review and we find our historiographical problem, that is shaped by what books and what articles have been digitized and what are digitized. It's shaped by the fun of the Omni search engine for those of us in Ontario who, find the book review always number 1 and the book always number 100. I'm being mean, but it's a pretty problem. We identify our primary sources, skewed heavily thanks to online finding aids. We analyze our primary sources by taking thousands of photos and reading them at home. We do keyword searches in databases that we barely understand, of documents that we don't know the provenance of. We write using our word processor, usually on one screen, the reproduction of a primary document on the other one, or on the iPad sitting at the side. We revise to the tyranny of track changes. We tease out our ideas not just through conferences or articles, but increasingly through blog posts and social media. And even our finished publication, that dissertation or book, we're beginning to have dimensions of changing business models, of digital marketing, of open access, and beyond. So I think once you start thinking about how the workflow has changed, research workflow has changed in the digital age, we can see that something is going on here that's not just a straightforward transformation of we used to work with documents and now we're looking at them through our screens. Now, none of this really comes out of the blue. Historians have been long engaging with technology in their work. That none of this is like a magic moment where suddenly the web came, where suddenly we had personal computers on our desk and scholarship has been transformed as if a lightning bolt from the sky. That historians have had a long history of engagement with technology. And I think we can gain something by looking back at how historians earlier thought about technology to sort of inform how we think about it today and perhaps the missed opportunity that's there. But in some of my other work, I've been thinking about looking back at historians of technology and how for decades we've really been worrying about how technology is going to change everything. That in 1966, the journal Computers and the Humanities was founded, and in an article I really love, written in 1970, the historian Robert Sorenga wrote, "Clio and Computers, a survey of computerized research in history." And in 1970, he was writing a retrospective historiography about how technology was transforming research. And sitting in 1970, Robert Sorenga saw himself as being as part of a third wave of computational research after the 1930s tabular data of the first generation of statistical researchers, to the historical demographers of the 50s and 60s, to then the advent of electronic records in the 1970s. That it all seems new, but in 1970, we were looking back as, being in the midst of a half-century long transformation of technology. And as Sorenga wrote, the effect of the computer on the study of history, whether desired or not, is inescapable. So sometimes it feels like we're in deja vu, what I'm doing here. But of course, I don't think many of you would know about this. Why don't we all learn about computationally enabled history, or what we might today call digital history? Why don't we know about that? Why don't more of us think consciously about computers and their impact on scholarship today? What happened to this rising current of scholarship in the 60s and 70s that began to grapple with how computers were going to change everything? Now, I'm aware Queens might be a bit of an outlier in how you do graduate education, thanks to, for those who aren't Queens has this History 901 course, which I've been trying to plagiarize at Waterloo unsuccessfully, where you actually think about methods and you grapple with field-wide problems. But I think a lot of graduate students and faculty haven't really given these questions much thought today. Now, part of that is because historians, well, we were really engaged with technology for a brief period in the late 60s, early 1970s. Historians as a field disengaged with technology. Part of that was because this wave of early research done with computers in the 70s culminated in, two sort of high watermarks that turned out to be low watermarks. The great analysis historian Leroy Ladurie writing in 1968 that the historian of tomorrow will be a programmer or he will not exist. Rubbing historians the wrong way. And of course, Time on the Cross by Fogel and Engelman, and the figure of, the average American slave receives 0.7 whippings a year, seen, at least in the reception of that book, as reducing the complex human experience of slavery to tables and charts on a page. And so throughout the 1970s, historians had an astoundingly quick decline in their engagement with technology. And I think, unfortunately, history and technology became seen as a niche thing to think about, and it became seen as a quantitative thing to think about. And so we've always had historians thinking about computers, thinking about technology, but they've been over at Social Science History Association. They've been publishing in a few journals. They're not really in the mainstream, where, as I'll be arguing today, they need to be. And the irony of that was that by the time the 1990s rolled around, historians were in retreat. We weren't thinking about technology at all. And it's ironic because it's in the 1990s when networked scholarship begins to transform academic research, both the web, the internet before it, and other forms of getting our libraries to talk to each other and using personal computing. And at this period, then, historians had begun to explicitly turn their back on thinking about technology. And I think this is a very big problem because by the 1990s, when it becomes clear that information is being digitized, that archives are going to go online, that other related professions begin to realize that the medium and the platform is going to transform the way we do research, historians weren't at the table. They weren't thinking about the sorts of transformations to our workflows that I opened my talk with. That there were exceptions. R.J. Morris, the editor of History and Computing in 1992, edited a special issue of History and Computing on electronic records in this great article, Back to the Future, Historians in the Electronically Created Record. And he said, in 1992, when did you first hand someone a text on a disk or send it by email? Almost certainly this did not represent a sharp break in continuity in your practice as a historian. The implications of the changes taking place in the nature of the historical record needs to be assessed by historians even before that process of change is complete. And I often like to drag this out when I'm talking to students, because first of all, how little did he know? I think there were these handful of historians early on who I actually just gave a whole 50-minute talk just on this group of historians, you know, who saw this coming. But in general, I don't think they grappled with the magnitude of what the internet and the web would represent. And I would say that in his case, all of these early conversations were not digitized, are left in inaccessible print volume journals. And nobody is really citing or referencing these earlier conversations because, as I'll return to, they've become invisible to databases. If they weren't digitized, nobody ever cites them anymore. So this whole early period of historians engaging with technology, partly because it's happening in more niche journals, doesn't get digitized, is actually ironically lost by the very technology that they thought to talk about. So to round up this first part of my talk then, this is our historical context. In the 1960s and 1970s, historians were at the forefront of grappling with technology. We were at the table at archives. We were engaged in roundtables. We were thinking about when the census was happening, how we would preserve the census for the next generation of historians. But by the 70s, 80s, and 90s, historians and quantitative methods are in retreat. Now, I think this is a bad thing. I think historical scholarship ends up being transformed without explicit theorization because we weren't looking. In other words, it all happened while we were asleep. And we were asleep because of this more or less accident of historical timing. Historians turn their back on technology just as technology becomes more important than I think we've yet really grappled with. And that's because of a simple point that sometimes surprisingly goes lost in historical thinking, which is that, of course, the shape and nature of our sources helps to create historical knowledge, just as much as historians do. We write our histories with primary documents, and how those primary documents are preserved, acquired, accessioned, described, provided to us, creates historical knowledge, just as I do sitting at Microsoft Word writing my book manuscript. And I think it's, if I can be a bit provocative, in general, historians don't always sufficiently theorize the role of their sources more generally. There's exceptions, and I think all historians know the actual target of our inquiry relatively well, but the overall process by which knowledge is constructed often remain outside the mainstream of historical inquiry. I know I'm being a bit provocative, it might be a bit of a straw man, feel free to challenge me. But I think we could see this if we start looking into archival theory and think about how archival theory shows us how our sources are constructed and the impact that has on historical knowledge. And that's because I think it's incontrovertible to argue that archives co-create knowledge. And we can see that by the process by which something happens in the past and ends up in historical knowledge today, that an event happened, that of course a document is recorded about a fraction of them, or memories are later interviewed or written. A fraction of these documents are actively, I'd underscore actively, selected for inclusion in an archive. These documents are then described, arranged, and ordered by an archivist, and then a historian consults a finding aid, and if you really want to bug an archivist, say, I discovered something that you curated for me. They really like that. You should go on Twitter and say, I discovered this in your archive, thanks to your finding aid. And I think for a lot of historians, when I lay this out, certainly in graduate education, a lot of this is new. And for a lot of archivists, this is clearly old hat. And it speaks to the sad disciplinary divide that I think has grown between historians and those who create the knowledge that we use to write our histories. That, of course, archives transform the histories that historians write. That, as Alexa Wallstrom wrote in a fantastic Past and Present article from 2016, historians are vaguely cognizant that they need to recognize the role that archives play in shaping the histories that they write, but there is still, as I say here, a broad tendency amongst historians to treat archives as neutral and unproblematic reservoirs of historical fact. That archivists and historians share common origins, but we have diverged. And I'm really convinced by the argument in Blue and Rosenberg's book, Processing the Past, that any visit by a historian to an archival institution, and I would include our online archival institutions, is now an exercise in interdisciplinarity. That, as Terry Cook wrote in this masterful article that was published in both the American Archivist and the Canadian Historical Review, we need to understand how archivists are co-creating the archive through appraisal. that they might select 1 to 5% of the documentary record that they preserve. There have always been too many documents to deal with. We can go back to papal records and see how there's this explosion, almost 100 years ago in this, that information abundance has always been with us, and archivists have always had to respond to information abundance by making these sorts of choices. That archival theory has transformed dramatically. And I like this contrast here, that if in 1922 there's the Manual of Archival Administration, which becomes the sort of guiding document of archival collection, the idea that archivists are archival custodians, the sort of handmaidens of history, arguably a approach that had persisted at Library and Archives Canada into the 1980s or the 1990s, where they were seen as uncritical conduits from past to present. But the 1970s in archival theory, really the idea from the Wisconsin state archivist, F. Gerald Ham, came to the rise, the idea of post-custodialism, where we need to actively understand archivists as activist archivists, not in a political sense, but in terms of how activist archivists are transforming and shaping the historical record. And so technology is just adding a layer onto this already existing rich conversation of, what changes when we can keep everything that's produced. What if an IT algorithm is deciding what's processed and what's ephemeral, what's transient? Is an email inviting your colleagues to lunch transient or ephemeral or part of the archival record? What's to be kept and what not? And so I wanted to go to that brief digression to archival theory, because I think that just as archivists and archives mediate the past, and hopefully if I could see you all in person, there'd be some nodding along with this, surely so do the new workflows that often librarians and archivists are designing are similarly transforming the way that we write history in the digital age. That we know from archival theory, and we know that from archives and technologies and portals, that all of them shape the way that we understand the past. And just if historians have traditionally paid too little attention to the role of the archive, I think we are now paying too little attention to the role of technology in mediating sources and workflows. It's another layer of complication to how we do our work. And I think we can see that in 3 places, which I'll go into a bit more detail now in my talk. And the idea of moving beyond anecdote and towards evidence and seeing how digital technology is transforming our work in the archive, database, and how it's transforming our work in the professional landscape. And I wanted to start with the archive in the first of my 3 sites. Because often I think for historians, we think with the archive, because of all the places in the workflow, surely the archive, that moment when we go, and I know we can be nostalgic because we're all stuck in our basements during COVID, but surely the archive where we actually and we open an archival box full of documents, remember that? We pull a file and we begin to read the document itself. Surely that, of all parts of the historical workflow, represents at least a vestigial element of a pre-digital workflow. But of course, when we go to an archive, and if I was, could poll you really easily, which I'm not going to try to do on Zoom, and said, who here has used a digital camera in the archive? If you were a representative sample of historians employed in Canada, all of you would put your hands up. Maybe 1 or 2 of you wouldn't, but all of you would put your hands up. We have 98 people in the audience. Yeah, you would all potentially be putting your hands up. And because we're remote and I can't ask you that, I put that question instead to colleagues across Canada. I surveyed almost 1,500 historians employed in Canada. I got about 250 responses, 95% of which said they used digital cameras in their archives, and a minuscule amount said they didn't or couldn't. And I think that bears out anecdote. If you go to an archive, you will see a reading room that is full of historians more or less developing lower back pain through archival photography, often using smartphones, just taking photos with documents that they'll then look at when they return to their home. And as I said in a recent article that just appeared in the Canadian Historical Review, might still be open access, actually, if you jump for it. It has like a 2-week window right now. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. But in Library and Archives Canada, if you go back to the policy as it was in 1995, that actually stood until November 2005, cameras were not allowed in those reading rooms. And if you wanted to take a photocopy, it was 20 cents a page. In November 2005, they launched the self-serve digital copying pilot. I remember this. I started to research around this period. I think I was a precocious Queen's undergrad who went down to Ottawa to do some work. First time I went, you couldn't do this. Second time I went, you could, but you had to sign a research agreement. You had to put a weird placard next to your seat that showed that you were allowed to use a camera. You filled out a roster, collecting some metadata about what you were taking. And crucially, you could only do it under the watchful eyes of the commissioner. That pilot was extended in April 2006 and made permanent in 2007. Now, I like that because it's the kind of thing that happens so quickly, happens over a period of 2 years, and it goes from a pilot to being established, and totally transforms our relationship to the archive. Just basically overnight, before we took notes or we took photocopies, suddenly we now all take digital photographs en masse. Massive change, relatively recent, and has had almost no theorization. That, as my survey showed, almost all of us are collecting our archival documents through digital cameras, and we're analyzing them when we get home. What does this mean? Well, over the last 20 years, we've seen a complete transformation of archival research. And it means that grants are written with the assumption that archival stays are more or less short and strategic. And fortunately, we, at least here in Ontario and in most places in Canada, it's been very lucky that digital cameras came out at around the same time that we decided as a government that we were going to be increasingly aggressive on the 4-year, or 5 in reality, PhD timeline, because suddenly we can talk about the ease of data collection, which is a phrase that most of us wouldn't have used 20 years ago. You know, as I'll show, the very way we talk about research is different because of this sort of approach using technology in archives. And we take a lot of photos. I made a mistake when I surveyed historians. I asked, how many photos did you take on your last substantive process? My highest bucket was more than 2,000. 40% of people checked that box. They took more than 2,000 photos. And if I took my 253 respondents and I said, if you said you took more than 2,000 photos, you took 2,001 photos, the people I surveyed took at least 250,000 photos. And if I was to be realistic about what that meant, it's at least 2 million photos from those people alone. And this worries me because it's this major change. A dramatic transformation has taken place in how we collect and think about information, but it has not been matched by training, support, or even much deep thought. 70% use their own device. And I think it's fine that we use our own devices, although it's weird that the taking of photos is so core to our research collection process that many of us are using iPhones, which we've probably picked not for its fidelity of archival photographs, but its fidelity for listening to Spotify or playing Pokemon Go. It's a core part of our professional toolkit that we didn't purchase for that reason. And 90% said, I received no training. And well, I think the common reaction of colleagues when I've said this to them is, who needs training on how to use a camera? Over half of the people I surveyed said that they were open to the possibility of training. That they said questions like, how should I store photos? How should I arrange them? How can I make sure they're not blurry? How do I do quality assurance? You know, the sense I got from my surveys has been that they got them all as sort of best practices swapped in reading rooms, seeing someone doing something and learning from it, but there must be a better approach. And more fundamentally, you know, beyond the technical, I think the most consequential thing is that historians are really lost when it comes, hey, what are we going to take photos of? You know, for the initial period, we select our sample of photographs to take at the very beginning of the project. Most historians don't look at the photos. They might glance at words here and there as they take photos, but their goal is to take as many as they can. And they select the decision of what they're going to be taking photographs of at the beginning of the project. At the period of your dissertation or book project where you know the bare minimum about that project is when you make the most consequential decision of what it is you're going to digitize. You know least, you make the most consequential decision. And I'm sure this happened before. People obviously used photocopies before, but there was a sense from people who lived through this transformation that before, historians would take notes in the archive or work much slower than they did today, but they would pull additional boxes. They would pursue rabbit holes, that their project would be shaped in connection with the archive in a way that isn't possible today. But as one PhD student put it, you know, said, hey, my use of digital photography is haphazard. I decided to do this because I'd seen another PhD student doing the same thing in the archive a few years before and saying that, hey, fairly random. We'll see if I took the right ones when it comes time to write things up. And this really stuck with me because a PhD is like somebody's life. This is a consequential thing to do. They don't have the support they need to do this research. They're being left in the midst of a technological transformation that they aren't supported or theorizing about. And the language of writing things up is becoming increasingly common. And again, that implies a sort of bifurcated, discrete collection phase and discrete thinking phase. Those who've done traditional research reminisce about how their research was shaped in the archive. They track down new leads. But now we don't have the archival rabbit hole to the same degree. We collect, and then we write it up. Except instead of being a 10-page computer science paper where we do that sort of thing, this is a 4-year-long dissertation project where there's problems. Now, I've been a bit negative, but overall, I love digital photography. And that's because we love it. Even the ones who had reminisced fondly about following archival rabbit holes, we're not going back. That we love it because we love our shorter research trips. The novelty of being in Paris for months wears off quickly. People want shorter research trips to spend more time with their family. Our own relationship as a profession with our families has changed for the better. Teaching and service, it's cheaper. We have the documentary record at our fingertips. People collect incidentally things that are later important. We can fact check in a way that we couldn't before. And I think crucially, the genie's out of the bottle. If you try to pitch to Shirk that you need to go to an archive for 10 months and you need a per diem for X thousands of dollars, et cetera, probably the peer review committee will say you could just go and take photographs. You need to actively show why you can't do the default, which is going to rapidly collect photos. And so I think of this as having significant implications for how we do our work and how we conceive of ourselves. And I begin to ask when I see this, are we becoming what I've seen at internal committees, at least here in Waterloo, the sort of pejorative desk discipline? Someone who sits at their desk at their office doing all of their research and not out in the archive where the real work happens. And if that's the archive, I think we can clearly see this in other forms of research as well. The way we engage with, for example, newspaper-based sources. Now, again, the older research process for working with newspapers or print material, and those who follow me on Twitter, I've been thinking a lot about microfilm lately and been going down this microfilm rabbit hole. And it turns out there's 5, just off topic, there's like 10 people in the world who care about microfilm, but they really care about microfilm. So you should care about microfilm too. If you want to talk, I love microfilm and I'm thinking about what we can do with it today. But, for most of you, when I say microfilm, you don't get all geeked out and happy. You probably frown a little bit because before, again, 20 years ago, if people wanted to look at periodical runs, such as newspapers or magazines, you were probably consigned to the dark basement, where you would crank forward through pages looking for relevant documents. Very analog, the old crank on the side of the machine, or, there's some mechanical machines as well. But in general, it was hard to really understand microfilm as anything other than time consuming and a little bit boring. Good chance to listen to music. But you would learn a lot about context, i.e. as you're going through the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Telegram or Saturday Night Magazine, etc., you're looking for things that are on your direct historical topic. And you find a global event that happens or a shooting. I remember doing research in the 60s and realizing, how significant the shooting at the University of Texas was for Canadians thinking about their campuses. And I wouldn't have known that if I just keyword searched around the edges. The tenor of advertisements or the relative placements of a columnist. This columnist that you cherry pick, were they prominently in the Globe and Mail or were they, fringe filler on the edges? But if I was to ask the question, if we were again in a live audience, how many people here would have used a microfilm machine? There would still be some hands, but I think it would be a generational divide. And some younger people are still using microfilm machines, but very limited and sparingly. And I was actually talking to our library, and I was in November was trying to work with one of my PhD students who needed to look at some microfilm reels. And I talked to the library and said, can we arrange microfilm access under COVID? And I got the sense by the degree that it was escalated, and I confirmed this later on, that it was November. Our campus closed in March. And it was in November that the library had received their first request to use a microfilm machine. That we're 41,000 students, we've got 1,350 faculty, and they had received one request for microfilm. And it was actually for my student who didn't want to use a microfilm machine. She wanted to see if she could find a service to digitize that microfilm machine to do some computational work with it. So this blew my mind, and it set me down this microfilm rabbit hole, because I always think of in the library, the most information of any room in the library, apart from the server room, is the microfilm room. And during COVID, nobody has used it, and nobody has wanted to use it. And that's because how do we actually deal with periodicals? Well, we do this. We keyword search. We go to Proquest historical newspapers. We search for things. I decided, hey, going into this talk, I would find something we all love here, at Queen's, FDR's famous speech at Queen's University in August 1938. I'd use that as the example. And then you actually see here on my Proquest historical newspapers, I searched for Kingston and Roosevelt in 1938, and I found no results. And I narrowed it down for the dates, and I was like, why didn't the Toronto Star talk about FDR's visit to Queen's University? And I went in and found out that actually, if you look at Proquest, there's nothing from August of 1938, because for some reason that reel was never digitized. If you were to search in historical newspapers for Proquest in August 1938, you won't find anything because it ends in July and starts again in September. And I discovered that, yeah, that's the case. For some reason, August 1938 is missing. I went to September 1938, the first issue of it, and was like, maybe the Toronto Star shut down. It's the Depression. Maybe they shut down for a month. I found referenced in the letters to the editor about articles that people had read in the last week. So something had gone wrong. And crucially, if I hadn't dove into it, you wouldn't know that there's an entire month of that Toronto Star run missing if you just did keyword searches. And that was the first month I went looking for. Literally the first thing I went looking for to provide some color for a talk was missing. And you start to go, what's going on? How little do we actually know about the sources that we use when entire months could be randomly missing from this data that we're not going to pick up? So the data is incomplete, but the interface and search and the way that modern interfaces are done make it feel complete. You don't see some proviso saying, here's what's missing. You see, I have X many results. Just like every other thing we do, from our banking to our, searching for the best, the best price on Cheerios in the online grocery store. So you begin to miss things, but most importantly, you don't know that you're missing things. There's other limitations as well. The text that you search is created using optical character recognition, or OCR. That Proquest stems from pages of the past. That said, OCR has improved, but it's really hard to improve OCR using open source techniques and information retrieval techniques when it's a closed proprietary database. There's problems with line break hyphenation. And just in general, having done some work in digital libraries, OCR is hit and miss. That even if we say the best case scenario on a scanned microfilm reel from 1938 is 98% success, that's ambitious, but that's possible. 98% of your words, of your characters are correct. You have 500 words, you're going to get 50 incorrect characters. And crucially, your word accuracy is going to be relatively low. And secondly, when we think about platforms, skimming is almost impossible. If I want to start skimming the Toronto Star, here I go. Let's pick a date in the 60s, which I used to be a historian of. We'll start at page 1, and we say, hey, I just want to start reading this to get the flavor of the time. Sort of what I would have done on a microfilm reel, and what a microfilm platform would have kind of encouraged me to do. Okay, let's go to the next page. Oh, you're on Safari, that's not working. I click it again in a fit of frustration, doesn't work again. Okay, something's wrong. I now type in 2. It loads up. I try to zoom in, doesn't really work that well. Okay, let's look at the PDF itself. I pull it up, I zoom in. There, we're finally getting to it. But as I see this, I hope you're kind of nodding along that skimming is nearly impossible. That Proquest and these other library platforms are really designed around keyword search. That platforms guide our behavior. Just like archives influence the records we have, the platforms we use to present this material transform how we do work as well. And of course, as I argue, and I will belabor the point because some of you may have read this, digitization is uneven, and that's of course both in Canada, where some newspapers are digitized, the most famous of course being the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the first two newspapers in the world to be fully digitized. This amazing story of an Ottawa entrepreneur who seized the potential of doing this before broadband internet is there, which would have made it possible. So it's a cool story, but the Globe and the Star get digitized, the Toronto Telegram doesn't. And we can see, as you see here in this article I wrote many years ago in the CHR, you know, as the Globe and the Star get digitized, their usage dramatically escalates. That I don't think is rocket science, but we can see that clearly the more that something is digitized, the more that it is used. The Toronto Star and the Globe versus the Telegram. Conversely, of course, archives digitize the things. I'm going to talk about this in the workshop tomorrow. Archives digitize things because they're popular, because we're kind of driven by metrics, at least in the organizations I'm part of. So there's sort of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But notably, we can see that the way we mediate a source clearly impacts its use. We don't use the Toronto Star and the Globe Mail because they're the best to use. We use them because they're digitized. And we can see that because of the way things have changed. And of course, this has also changed the way that we think about global histories. And I think of Queen's because when I think of history departments in Canada that are leading the charge on global history, you know, Queen's University is clearly probably the leader in global history with your Global History Initiative. And our approach to global history, as Laura Putnam, a great historian at the University of Pittsburgh, has argued, that we couldn't do global history the way we do it today if it wasn't for digitized sources. That as she writes in this masterful American Historical Review article, technology has exploded the scope and speed of discovery. But as she sees here, the more far-flung the locales linked through our discoveries, the less consistent our contextual knowledge. The place-specific learning that historical research in a pre-digital world required is no longer baked into the process. We make rookie mistakes. That we've all seen that. We could sit in an archive and we could read, we're sitting in Cape Breton and we read about a fisherman's strike in England. And we type it into our search engine. We go to Wikipedia, we go to the Haddie Trust, we go to books. We try to see, hey, what's going on with this? And as Putnam argues in her piece, the impact of such side glancing, formerly rare, as such glance would have demanded hours or days with likely no return, now requires nanoseconds to search and read. That we have a peripheral vision where I can quickly do a keyword search in the National Archives of the United Kingdom and drag down things, but I don't really know much about that circumstance, the context of that archive, or really anything about English fishermen, but maybe that ends up as a citation in a broader argument I'm making about global histories. That do we lose something when we devalue place-based expertise in favor of search? That now that all of these databases and archives are increasingly, not all of them, but there are more and more being digitized and searchable, you know, could you be a leading historian of the Winnipeg General Strike without having been to Winnipeg or having just been for 2 days taking photos? A Nigerian historian without having been to Nigeria or just, again, whirlwind surgical strikes to get to take photos? What do we gain and what do we lose when our interactions with our sources are in clicks? Clicks on our screens or a week of screens through a camera rather than forging these deep months-long connections? What about our relationships with fellow researchers and libraries and archivists? And of course, even after showing you all this, we're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg. As so much becomes digitized, it's important to remember that most things are undigitized. That the Star and the Globe are used more than ever before, but their like-minded periodicals aren't, or ones that weren't digitized aren't. Same with archival resources. There's a few really rich resources that are being cited again and again and again, and leaving the less cited ones behind. So let's take stock as we come towards some conclusions. This has been transformed as we transition to surgical strikes to gather thousands of documents to bring home. Our work in newspapers and other digitized resources has changed as we're drawn towards the digitized and away from contextually aware research. And we're influenced by algorithms we don't understand. So what should we do? What should we do as a profession to deal with this? Well, first, I think we need to up the level of digital literacy more generally, not only in our historical profession, but probably in the humanities more broadly. that we need to recognize that all historians have been transformed by these forces, whether they are digital historians or not. I provocatively say, we are all digital now. It's not just a niche researcher over in the corner, who you turn to fix a department printer once in a while, and they do digital stuff and you're not affected. We're all digital. All of our sources are mediated through technology or our archives. And by consciously thinking about this, by citing our mediated sources, by thinking about methods, will make us better and more transparent historians. That I think more generally, historians have shied too long away from discussion of methods, seeing them again as niche and quantitative, relegating our discussion of methods to footnotes. Editors often want to cut them to keep a narrative lively and engaging. But we need to be more conscious about reflecting in our writing and teaching on mediation through archives and mediation through technology that informs their work. We need to have more method sections. We need to recognize also that interdisciplinarity is core to who we are. That when you use an archive, you're being interdisciplinary. We need to cite our archivists. They've been having these conversations about technological mediation for decades. We need to cite them. We need to engage with them. We need to discuss with them, hey, what's going on here? Every time we use a search engine or a database, I was a program chair for a computer science conference in this field. It's an entire field around designing library search engines and ranking things and doing user surveys, et cetera. We are the users. We are the users of academic colleagues who are developing these systems to provide us better information. That's interdisciplinarity, and we don't think about it that way. We just think of these as passive platforms that aren't actively co-creating historical knowledge with us. So we need to read that literature. We need to talk to our librarians who, digital libraries are at the forefront of their profession as well. And then crucially, I think we need to privilege methodology. That when we think of hiring, and I'm sure faculty in the room, hiring is always the most fraught decision any department in the world does. And when we think of hiring, everywhere I've been thinks in terms of geography and not method. We need to hire a Canadianist. We need to hire an Americanist. We need to hire a British historian. We need to hire a European historian, excluding England or Britain. We need to hire a global historian. But we very rarely think of method. We very rarely hire method first and geography secondly. And that reflects the way we catalog our courses, that reflects our undergraduate classes, that reflects the fields that go up to the Ontario government when we structure graduate programs. But I think that's a real lost opportunity because we need to foreground method. We need to foreground digital literacy. We need to make room for those method sections. And we need to understand that these forces are transcending all fields and forming a basis of what it means to be a historian. And of course, that means we need to change how we train. We need those required undergrad methods courses. We focus on content, we deliver content, we tell masterful stories in our courses. But these are things that aren't just germane to Canadianists or Americanists or Europeanists or globalists. These are things that are germane to what it means to be a historian in the digital age. We need to have required courses. And I know they're unpopular amongst students and instructors, so it's easy for me to say, but there's a role for this sort of foundational knowledge of what it means to be a historian. That when we moved into the graduate level, especially the PhD and especially the MA, we focus on content, not craft. Queens, again, I really, maybe it doesn't work out in principle. On paper, it looks great to have all PhD students working together in a common seminar, thinking about what it means to be a historian, thinking about craft. And I think we don't have that at most universities where we, again, go into content-based silos and learn content, but not the skills to interpret that content. And then finally, this is getting into the weeds for PhDs, but we primarily develop our PhDs through an apprenticeship model. And that's good, but an apprenticeship model doesn't always scale well when we're living through a massive paradigm, a massive technological shift, where what worked for us in our PhDs might not work for the next generation of historians because it's all quickly changed in the interim. Now, some of this is happening in dribs and drabs around here, but to editorialize, at Waterloo, we're with Guelph and Laurier in our Tri-U program, a Canadianist and a medievalist might never cross paths professionally in their training. The Canadianists take their course over here with their Canadian colleagues, medievalists are taking courses over there with their medievalist colleagues, and they never move together because they're just focused on content, not the things that unite them. So I think we're seeing some change. The Queen thing I'd love to hear. You could write me privately if I should continue to try to plagiarize your program. It's borrowing inspiration. We're seeing special sections in fora in the Canadian and American historical reviews. We're seeing roundtables at the AHA beginning to grapple with this. Unfortunately, not so much at the CHA. I don't quite know why. I can tell you, if we were having, I could tell you a story about a rejected CHA proposal once that a colleague and I sometimes laugh about. But to me, this is a defining issue, that we are becoming a desk discipline. What does that mean? And of course, if we even take off our history hats, this isn't just history. My focus is on history because it's the Nugent lecture and we're all historians and we love history. But the digital transformation is cutting across all of our disciplines. That all of our students, and I originally put humanities and social sciences, and then I said the university, we need to understand algorithmic bias. We need to understand the mediation and contextualization of content. We need digital literacy skills. We need to banish the idea of the digital native, that we need to really start to think about how everything is changing with these new mediums. And I don't think the way our universities are structured along disciplinary lines necessarily well captures what we'd see. That, in a separate talk, I actually argued a few weeks ago, we need to go back to liberal education. We need to go back to those sort of shared vision of what a new version of liberal education would look like in the 21st century. So I've taken enough of your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions and answers. I'll quickly conclude by saying, my top line take homes from this lecture are that the historical profession is being transformed by new and emerging digital technology. We haven't sufficiently engaged with this shift, but we need to as educators and researchers. Most of this is good. We're not putting the genie back in the bottle, but we need to be self-conscious and we need to be aware that we understand the resources and approaches that we're drawing on. In other words, we're all digital now. Let's embrace it as a profession. So my sincerest thanks to you all. I look forward to your questions. I want to thank you. Some of the research talking about today has been supported by SSHRC, but of course the most special thanks are to the support of the annual Nugent lecture series and to Bernice Nugent from the class of 1938. So thank you very much and really looking forward to the discussion we're going to have.
Thanks, Ian. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. That was really provocative, and I think there will be a lot of questions. We have about half an hour. So as I said before, if you have a question, just drop a note in the chat box, and I will call on you. James McNutt. James, would you like me to read your question? Okay, great. James asks, when I was at the University of Toronto in 2012, there was a lecture by Robert Darnton, Harvard librarian, and he said he was going to digitize every book in the library system and make it open access. I don't know if he ever did, maybe you know, but can you comment about what that would mean for history scholarship?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, James. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, every book at, for example, the University of Toronto, again, librarians could correct me, to the best of my knowledge, every book at the University of Toronto Library, for example, Robarts, and then that library system has been digitized. Every book at Michigan has been digitized, every book at Illinois has been digitized, et cetera, et cetera. You're seeing the fruits of that through the Hattie Trust project. It would be transformative, but the problem is, another thing we don't always think about as historians, because we luckily haven't, is the problem of copyright. So publishers and libraries and technology companies have been really stuck in sort of litigation and ways to how can we balance scholarly access without all of that information getting dumped somewhere on the open web. Like their biggest fear is all these books are going to be digitized. They're going to escape from a controlled environment. And suddenly anybody can BitTorrent every book that ever existed and the publishers will fall apart. So Hattie Trust, for example, has, they've got all this, and many of you have probably used books through their emergency temporary access service during the pandemic. That came out of the aftermath of Google Books. There was a lawsuit, and Google Books handed those back to Michigan and Illinois to create what became the Hattie Trust to access. But if you want to do something really scaled up, if you want to have unfettered access, hit and miss on whether you can download the book due to copyright. It's hit and miss on the ways you can access it. And yeah, I can say like there was this, I'm writing about this right now, so I'll try not to talk for too long, but there was this moonshot, basically in the late 2000s, the aughts. Google and Microsoft Bing and Yahoo, each of them said, if we could digitize all the books and put them in our search engines, we would get a competitive edge over the other search engines. So there was a bunch of money available to do all this. And then unfortunately, because of litigation, that money dried up. Google, Yahoo completely fell apart and abandoned it. Microsoft abandoned it. Internet Archive is trying to do it, but Internet Archive is also in litigation right now. They were sued by the major publishers during the first phase of the pandemic around loaning out beyond their digital lock provisions and stuff like that. So it's, yeah, James, I think it's a great question. They're doing it. It would be great for historical scholarship, but the publishers are so afraid of it, understandably, because it's not compatible with their business model, that it's a litigation minefield.
Nancy.
Hello, Ian. My name's Nancy Van Duzen. I came in late, so please forgive me if I'm asking you something that you already talked about, but this is just a fascinating talk. I work on Indigenous slavery. And so what's interesting to me is how it has disappeared historiographically. So keyword searches connected to Library of Congress subject headings are of interest to me because, and so my general question is, keyword searches and subject headings tell us what we think we should know and how we should know it. But if they don't exist, then we don't know that it exists and so that influences the way we think about research, the way we think about historical problems and what we research. And that's even more critical now. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sort of the broader questions of classification of knowledge, like with LC.
The classification and then the production of knowledge that's related to that, because we can only know what we think we should know because of these subject headings or keyword terms. We research what they tell us to research.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, part of it is it's a great question because my answer will probably be insufficient because I'm making notes to think about this more after the talk and in my own writing. You know, it's funny. Classification is something I hadn't thought much about until I'm sitting on a committee at Library and Archives Canada, where we're thinking about doing all this reclassification of content under, you know, I mean, there's outdated terminology, there's racist terminology, there's new models of framework, and the whole process of transforming these subject headings and moving stuff around reflects, I think, better our again, I'm just speaking for myself, not for any other institution, you know, better reflects our values as a society and reflects our contemporary understandings of this, but then raises downstream discoverability problems because we're going to reclassify stuff that was legacy cataloged. Yeah, I mean, I think my only real thought is that it's something we need to be more conscious of. That it's funny being privy to these conversations. I'm usually the token historian on a lot of these committees. And it's stuff that I had never thought of until I was actually in that room and we're getting into the weeds of classification of knowledge. And it had just sort of probably, if I was being totally honest, classification was something that just seemed to be handed down from up on high. And I took it as an article of faith. And now you realize how complicated it is and how casual it is. And as someone who works at Interdisciplinary, like does my book get classified library and information science or history, has dramatic decision, you know, influence on its discoverability. And no one seems to know how that decision takes place. It just happens. A cataloger somewhere makes a decision and it gets propagated down. So yeah, Nancy, thanks for the question. And it's the kind of thing we need to know more about and think more about. And it's the kind of thing I'm now going to think more about and maybe do some Yeah, try to do some research, because I find when you go down these weeds, like I am with microfilm, you find this entire rich literature of people talking about cataloging, subject headings, historically and today, a lot of it in the gray literature. And that's actually where HathiTrust has been beneficial, because HathiTrust, because of Illinois, especially in Michigan, having these big library schools, have digitized reams of gray literature that previously probably I wouldn't have gotten until we joined the HathiTrust, where you have these super intense periodical-based conversations around cataloging standards. Yeah, hopefully that helps as a first thing to say. It's an active thing of conversation that until I started working with Library and Archives Canada, I'd never thought about, probably like most historians.
David Parker.
Oh, hi, Ian. I want to, first of all, start with just a quick anecdote that I was, I think, the first person to bring a digital camera into the newspaper archive of the National Library of Uruguay, and they stuck me in the basement next to the microfilm guy. And we became friends, and he was doing his microfilms, and I was doing my digital photographs, and he was fascinated with seeing. But my question is actually more like Nancy's question. In countries like Uruguay or Chile or others, countries that have limited funds for digitization, I think this builds really on the kind of question that Nancy asked. It seems to me, and I'm seeing this happening, that curatorial decisions on what gets digitized are actually made in ways that seem to be constantly reinforcing old paradigms, nationalistic histories of what's important and what's not important. And so I really see this sort of rich get richer, poor get poorer Matthew kind of effect as being possibly really, really bad for innovation in history.
Yeah, I completely agree. I like that Uruguay story too. No, and I think having seen and having sat on, I also sit on the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, as well as LAC. So lots of these digitization discussions, which may be different than what's going on in other countries. But part of me thinks that it's not, because digitization is so tough. And I think we again, going into this, I often didn't see how tough it is, because it's not just reproduction, it's the description, it's the metadata. It's usually, if you're in a national library, getting that long-term storage where you can say, hey, this is a terabyte of data we're going to preserve in perpetuity, which has a giant price tag on it, more than the Best Buy hard drive. And so it means when I see people making decisions, and I've most of this, again, North America and Europe, where I've done national library visits, there is the tyranny of metrics, and it's unfair. So traditional print resources and archives, there isn't the sense when I look at library and archive managers of saying, only 3 people have consulted this obscure font. Let's throw it out. Like that just wouldn't be a discussion. Whereas with digital stuff, metrics pop up right away. You can measure it, you can do Google Analytics. And so part of it as a response, we say, hey, this is our most consulted collection. Let's digitize it to A, reduce the strain on the print resource. And B, if we digitize this, we're going to get really good hits. We're going to get good metrics. That's going to look good on my year-end report when I say that 100,000 people from across the country have consulted this document. And you pick that document because it was already well consulted, because you want to have good numbers. And it also reflects contemporary values. It's a scarcity thing. And so if you're an administrator, you're looking at metrics, and then you want to find contemporary values that reflect where we are. So in Canada, we digitize things based on high use, and then we also digitize things based on truth and reconciliation. That's a big strategic priority of the government. Let's put emphasis into digitizing that sorts of material. But we saw pushback under the Harper Harper libraries. It's more complicated than I can do justice to. Generally not in a good way, but priorities would have reflected a different vision of what Canada was. Yeah, I think basically we're seeing digitization reflects metrics and reflects contemporary values, and both of those things are probably a reinforcing cycle. So thanks for the question. And it's funny you mentioned being the first person. I haven't dug this down. Apparently Bradell, who's everywhere, apparently he brought like a film camera into an archive and was using motion picture recordings, which is a story I don't know enough about, but I want to dig down into it. the logistics of doing film recording in an archive.
Yeah, I know a guy who did that too in,
Yeah,
in that transition period. Yeah.
Yeah, it's intense.
Okay, I'm going to read Vera's question. So many archives are going online and are created by activists. What role do these activist archives have in the writing of history?
Yeah, thanks, Vera. That's a great question. So it's funny that probably the archivist response would be here that those aren't archivists. Those aren't archives. Sorry, that there's lots of gatekeeping around the term archives, which I'm sure you know this, Vera, coming from a program. But archivists would those like special collections, and they're using archive in the sort of colloquial sense of like I have a zip archive, I have a personal archive, not an archive in the formal sense of an archive that's been arranged, described, and curated and given over with respect to file and all the guiding archival principles. But I think those are really important. I think especially a lot of these archives today are reflecting that memory institutions aren't as quickly able to respond to an environment when things are changing. Like Occupy Wall Street's going on. The protests in Minnesota, in Minneapolis against police brutality are going on. This could be ephemeral material. There's tons of ethical questions. This is ephemeral. It's rapidly evolving. Activists want to make sure that stuff is preserved before A, it's deleted, or B, due to the sort of APIs and sort of platform plumbing of Twitter and Facebook and websites, et cetera, that it doesn't disappear. And they can move quickly and they can innovate in a way that a national library can't. So I think they're going to have a really good role. But of course, my biggest fear with all of these activist archives is sustainability. And that's where, libraries and archives, and they do this, there needs to be outreach, institutional support, because there's a lot of stuff that happens, sits on a website, and then as we all know, and from my previous work, which I didn't talk about today, like it can quickly die. You don't pay a server fee, it disappears. Activists especially, which can be factitious. In the aftermath of Occupy Wall Street, something like 40% of all Occupy Wall Street sites were dead within two years. And there was some schism, like the webmaster for Occupy Wall Street then had a fairly dramatic political shift and is now sort of an alt-right type. I don't want to libel people, but there's all these personal disagreements, takes down all those sites, you get a 404 error and it's gone. So yeah, I think they play an important role, but we need to make sure that we don't just give platforms to people to create archives, but we also, pair that with institutional support and plans to like transfer material to somewhere where it can live long term, like a national library, like Queen's University, like special archives or collections, not someone's basement where it's really going to be ephemeral.
Okay, the next question is from Samuel Imaha. I would like to ask you about the we in your topic. Are we all digital historians? Who are we? Are those historians whose archives are not exclusively written sources part of this digital we? And I am particularly thinking about historians who work in non-Western archives.
Yeah, that's a great question, Samuel. And I'm conscious of the limitations in my knowledge, given that the survey work I've done is mostly with Canadian-based historians of all different fields. I would say actually, like I was just teaching a course on ethics. So we were doing a session on ethics and oral history in the digital age. And digital history, it's increasingly another one of these subfields that's being just transformed by digitization. And indigenous historians, the ones in my department, the ones I've worked with, are like leaders in this digital thing and have added a lot to complicated our understanding of access, and our sort of default towards open access needs to be reconsidered. Our default towards sharing knowledge, the way our content management systems sort of ascribe and reify knowledge is really complicated. So I would probably say I think we're all affected by these digital turns. It's hard for me to imagine any historian, at least working in North America, who isn't. But again, I'll admit my ignorance. I don't know the state of technology in the developing world with historians. I've worked with some, but it would be probably a biased sample of people who are interested in technology and technological change.
Great. Okay, I'm going to read a question from Paula Renee Curtis. even though it's clear that there is a digital shift being accelerated right now, both for those that ostensibly consider themselves DH or digital humanities people and those who don't. But as you say, are digital, whether they want to be or not, how can we make the case to departments or the powers that be to make the hires that value this work? Academia is slow to change on this front, to the disadvantage of many who are putting in the work or ready to.
Yeah, thanks for this question. How can we make the case? I actually, so I'm of two minds with this because we go through this in our own department. On the one hand, I think a department could make a case to a dean, sort of like I have, of saying we've got this whole, it's a new area of research and we are, this is essential. Probably how I would do that at an institution is, speaking of my own institution, I think there's the divide between undergrad teaching and research. I think you can make a very strong research case. And I think if you look at a strategic plan, again, I don't know Queen's strategic plan, I know Waterloo's. Digital is a big part of Waterloo's strategic plan. And if we were able to think of hires that sort of transcended barriers, we said this is going to be a joint hire, 51% history and 49% science and technology, or 49% computer science, if you could bridge gaps, that there would be openness to do that sort of thing. But I really do, I think that, Paul, I don't know the real answer because it's so specific on departments, but often it's tricky, right? Because I'll editorialize. When we do hires, I think, and I'll be mean, historians often, when a historian is retiring, they want to see themselves replaced with a carbon copy of themselves. So and that's because the way we think of it as a Canadianist, we think of a Canadianist as owning a line. And so when like my senior Canadianist colleague retires, their main goal is to make sure that they are replaced by a Canadianist. And it's articulated that way, and we'll say, well, Professor X retired, let's fill Professor X lines with the same thing. And my pushback, which half my colleagues like and probably half dislike, is like we're not wedded to the decisions we made in 1968 when our department was formed to always have the straightforward reproduction of people. So I think it's trying to think less parochially when we think about departments and renewal strategies. But that's easier said than done, because probably when I'm like 69 and I'm retiring, I'll be like yelling at my colleagues to replace me with the digital historian, and they'll be saying, no, holographic history is the next thing. And so it's easy for the young person who's not a department chair to say that sort of thing. But it's something I just try to be conscious of and try to agitate myself of maybe there's strategic synergy, because again, this matters to English, this matters to Soc, this matters to every department to think about digital transformation. And it matters to funding, there's a lot of money for digital transformation, and there's not enough people doing what I do, judging by the amount of service I do. I'm a unicorn, and that's good, but it's also not sustained. It doesn't show that there's a sustainable and healthy ecosystem when there's the same person doing all the committee work. So thanks for your question.
Awet.
Thank you, Lisa. Ian, this is a provocative and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you for that. In the mid-2000s, when I was a doctoral student, I thought of myself as a cutting-edge historian using technology, until my research and my equipment were entirely stolen, and I have ever since been traumatized. Part of my question has been asked by Samuel already. There is this Haitian anthropologist that historians like to use a lot, Trio, with his Silencing the Past. And what that book does, and I like to keep reading it over and over again, is that it consciously or unconsciously silences significant part of history, and the erasure of significant part of the world in the process of archiving is massive. Sometimes we notice it, sometimes we don't even notice it because we're not aware of it. Now, when you add this layer of technology, this erasure and the silencing doubles in some parts of the world. And history as a discipline may have missed the boat in terms of being at the table when these processes were being formed, more so parts of the world that I study, Africa and Southeast Asia. What can we do to close the gap? I understand you're not an Africanist or Southeast Asianist, but as someone on the cutting edge of this discipline, maybe you'd have thoughts that we could start exploring. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for, I've taken some I'm taking notes from all your questions because this is all work I'm working on. So I will, I really appreciate it. What can we do? And here's where I'm always of two minds, because I don't want to tell people in other countries what they should do, not being fully cognizant of their local context, et cetera. I can speak to, web archiving, which is an area that I professionally work in. And there's a web archiving. Web archiving is expensive. It's really expensive. It's dominated by the global north. And so there's discussions around, should we, something in Africa, there's an event going on in Africa. We want to create a digital footprint of it. Should we reach down and grab all that stuff and then it sits on a server in Paris? Is that good in the sense that we're stewarding history that could be useful for a political movement, or could be useful for a number of contexts to have a record of, political instability or a sporting event or something, an international event, or even just daily internet life in a country? Or is it colonialism? Is it colonialism when we reach down, not with troops, but we're reaching down with web crawlers and we're grabbing material and we're going to store it in Paris and we're going to make all the decisions around what to do with this cultural heritage, et cetera. So probably the best in web archiving, again, speaking for the area I know professionally the best in the archives world, is partnerships. It's partnerships and money, and it's developing tools and recognizing that for a host of reasons, sustainable long-term, like petabyte scale in storage infrastructure, there's only a few places in the world that can carry that off. But what if we start mirroring copies? So Alexandria, for example, the bibliothèque, the new Library of Alexandria has a copy of the Internet Archive. So they have the big server room. I would like to go there to see it. They keep this material. They make local collections. There's funding available in that community to make sure that people can come to international organizations. And there's development of platforms, and like, you collect this material, but we're going to keep a sustainable backup copy in this data center in San Francisco, where for a host of reasons, whether it's local government interference, whether it's power instability, we then have this copy as well. That said, like, we're thinking about Africa and South Asia, Southeast Asia, et cetera. There's also the flip side that after Donald Trump was elected in the United States, there was the rest of the world started to go, like, the US is still a democracy, but there's some troubling risk factors. We hadn't really thought about the long-term longevity of information in the United States if something politically was going to happen. And so that was the impetus to, like, let's put some info into Canada, let's put some info into the Netherlands, let's put some info into Egypt. That by distributing this stuff, we help each other. But of course, cognizant that there just is more funding in the global north for these sorts of things, especially once you're getting into digital infrastructure, which is expensive and seen as niche. So thank you.
Emma.
Hi, Dr. Milligan, thank you so much for your talk. This has given, I think, all of us a lot to think about. I guess what I was wondering, so about, when you're talking about research techniques and things like using keyword searches and time spent in the archive, and as a graduate student, I think speaking for a lot of graduate students in this department, I'm wondering about the way in which you are attributing the reason why we do certain things, right? So why is it that we take hundreds of photographs? Why is it that we aren't in Paris for 5 months, et cetera? So I was wondering if you wanted to talk more about the material and financial considerations, which in a way are forcing people to become digital historians, as you say. Like, I think, and plus with COVID, right? So I, for instance, was supposed to be at an archive in Australia for 4 months, and I would love to be in Australia in the archive for 4 months. It's not the dream to be trolling through things online. And so how, I guess, issues like graduate funding, along with things like you're saying, training, I guess, how do you think that plays into this switch, the digital that you're talking about? Because I agree that part of it is just the way that some documents are archives, but like for myself, I do research into childhood history. And so a lot of those documents actually aren't archived. You have to sign NDAs to look at them. They deal with child welfare concerns. And so they're kind of exempt from this. But on the other hand, like you're saying, I'm kind of forced into being a digital historian due to the fact that it's a pandemic, and also I don't have thousands of dollars to spend. So I guess I just wondered what you thought about that sort of aspect of this problem.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's, it's something I in my writing, I stress this because I think, why do people do digital cameras? It's the same reason like I would do this. It's a mixture of funding constraints, and I think there's an imagined gold age of funding has always been a constraint, but that meant a lot of this research was limited to like a handful of institutions, and there's been a democratizing. People on higher teaching loads, people with less research funding can do research that they couldn't do before. So I think like the short answer is like we do what makes sense within the resources that we have. Another part that I believe is family, and I think from this is more anecdote because it wasn't part of my survey, but there's the same reason the faculty club isn't like hopping every night at 5 o'clock. People are going home to their families. That there is a recognition that work-life balance is more of a thing, that families are important, that there's two working partners in academic couples. All of these things have these downstream implications on how we do our work. So I mean, I think you've laid it out. Like as soon as digital photography comes along, it changes the scope of projects really quickly. That you have the ability to collect information you wouldn't have otherwise. So probably you collect far more documents. The relevancy might be there or not, but you can do that strategic strike. Yeah, so I really do. I don't think there's any judgment because I put it this way. Like I do research. I've got family circumstances. I can't go anywhere for more than a week, basically, period. So if I'm doing archival research, I take photographs. If I'm doing interviews, I line them up. If I'm doing conferences, like I do in and out, and I'm aware that it changes my research. I'm going to try to be conscious about it in my next book project, but yeah. And I think that's the thing, right? If we assume we're all uneven, there's something where you say, hey, why, and I see this when I do peer reviews, why did you look at this article? And sometimes you see that tortured, and I've been called out for this, tortured reason. And you invent a reason for like, I looked at this archive and I did all this because of these tortured historical reasons. And the real answer is like, well, because I only had $5,000 and I had a baby. Like, and that's the real answer, but we'd never say that. And I don't know if peer reviewers are ready for us to say that, but there is some element to being transparent of like, yeah, I looked at the Toronto Star and the Globe Mail because they were digitized, and I wasn't going to sit in the basement looking at the Toronto Telegram for 7 months on diminishing returns. But maybe if you think about that, but here's what I might be missing because the political perspective of that newspaper is different than that other one. So yeah, I hope that helps. I mean, I think really we do the things we do because of the context we're in and the resources and time that we have and all the intersection of all those forces.
I'm conscious of the time and I was next in line, but so I'm going to take this opportunity to cut off the questions because I will get a chance to ask tomorrow in the workshop. So I will just note that there's a few other comments, follow-up questions. And one of the nice things about the Zoom forum is that it creates an archive of those things for us, or archive. I'm going to use that word a bit more cautiously. So I think I'm going to wrap it up by just extending again a really sincere thank you for such as many in the audience have said, a really thought-provoking discussion and giving us a lot to think about and challenging us to think a bit more about our methodologies, which I think we all could do. So with that, I'm going to bring our 2021 Nugent lecture to a close. I wish we could all give you a round of applause, but we'll do it emoji style. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for and feel free to email if you have any follow-up questions or, yeah, and I'll see some of you at the workshop tomorrow.
Thank you so much.